This episode of the Move Mind podcast was brought to you by CBD Mountain, the sport and fitness CBD. Head over to cbdmountain.com for a range of soft gels, skin balms, oils and vapes, and purchase online and have the premium quality CBD delivered directly to your door. cbdmountain.com. Welcome to the Move Mind podcast. My guest this time is Joey Fritz, mental coach and performance psychology consultant. If you didn't check out episode 9, we had Joey on. Joey works with a host of professional strikers and mixed martial artists at Elevation Fight Team down in Denver, Colorado. And he received his MA in sport and performance psychology from the University of Denver in June 2016. Joey, welcome back. Thanks for coming back on, mate.
Going on, Harry. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, super stoked. Well, I guess most recent accolades, we saw Mr. Sandhagen in the UFC recently absolutely demolished the legend that is Frankie Edgar.
Yeah.
With that crazy flying knee, mid-air walk-off, is that such a thing? Or mid-air look-back.
The feet weren't even on the ground.
Feet weren't even on the ground whilst Frankie, bless him, was starched. And also his win against Moraes not long before that with the spinning back hook kick to the head or spinning back kick to the head. Just amazing. Clean. Two very clean wins back to back after coming off of a loss where many people, and I think himself included, and maybe you can attest to it, felt like he didn't get to showcase his true skills. And then he came back with two incredible knockouts where you couldn't really showcase your skills any better than that. I don't want you to give away all your secrets because you work with these guys on a private basis, but I do want to know, what on earth did you guys sit down and talk about to change or to bring out Cory's, Sandman assassin moves?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot, like, it almost sounds cliche to talk about the idea of mindset is everything, right? And he's been very open about the idea of when he was going into that Aljo fight, the moment he stepped in, when he felt really calm, cool, and collected, leading all the way up to it, and then he saw Aljamain just pacing back and forth in the ring across from him, right? In that moment, there was something clicked, right? About, am I in the right mindset? Is this what how I need to feel when I step into here? And this person across from me is ready for violence, right? And in that moment, I think he just had a decision or had a thought in his mind where he realized that this person came out was hungrier than him and came at him with that same veracity, right? And unfortunately, like you said, he didn't get to showcase what he had been working on, what he was working towards his entire camp up to that point. And I mean, during a time of that was right at the beginning of those camps all started. I mean, it's the same for Aljamain as well, right? But those camps all started at the beginning of COVID, and um, there was a lot of strife going on in the world at the time that could really influence where those mindsets were. So, in the context of mindset matters, for him, right, it really clicked that this is something that not only have I always been working on for a while, that maybe there's a different way to approach or to come into this space.
Yeah, that's a fascinating idea, because you'd think in a sport like MMA, your MO is to go in there and be as violent as possible.
Yeah.
But actually, there's a lot of obstacles, perhaps, or mental roadblocks where people are like, well, there's going in there to fight, but there's also going in there to absolutely hurt someone, like really do some damage, and they almost seem like different kind of mindsets to some people. What is it about being violent towards others in a cage, as violent as possible, that some fighters find difficult?
I mean, I think it's just a general, I can't speak to it too intelligently on the idea of maybe the absolute why, but I think ultimately we don't want to hurt each other, right? So there's this really influential book called On Killing, right, by Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, and he wrote very deeply on the subject about how humans really don't have a capacity for violence, right? And in that, he speaks to the idea of, and they go back after researching battlefields from the Revolutionary War, from the Civil War, from other battles, right? They found that they started to learn that there was a lack of engagement by the majority of those who were there. I mean, they found this by seeing like a lot of the rifles they found were loaded multiple times, right? And those old musket loaders, they were loading in multiple shots. They don't work that way, right? You load in the powder and then you put the bullet in, and then you fire it from there. But if you load it multiple times, it's obviously not going to fire. But they wanted to look like they were doing something, and they wanted to posture, right? So we see this in animals, we see this in people all the time. Whether you see the yoked up guy walking around and just being very intimidating, right? But ultimately, they're not going to fight. You see this in animals who make themselves bigger and try to scare other animals off, right? By posturing, but they don't ever, they rarely ever lead to violence. And so I think what they found in these battlefields is some 70 to 80% of the people engaged didn't, or people that were part of those battles ultimately didn't engage. They pointed their rifles, they were acting like they were busy and loading, but they were firing away from somebody. They weren't firing at somebody. And so this idea of the capacity for violence, and when we ultimately get put in that space, the impacts it has on us is can be pretty profound, right? And in war and things like that, in the comes out in the idea of like PTSD and the psychological detriments and the cost, ultimately the cost that comes of that, which is the focus of that book in On Killing, right? So there aren't many humans, the majority of us do not have the capacity for violence. And there's this resistance, I think, that comes with that. But we are very competitive, right? We're competitive in so many ways, right? We're competitive whether it is for resources, we're competitive sexually, we're competitive for friends and partners and social groups and what have you. And that I starts to kind of counteract or comes at a headway with this idea of we're being competitive in this space that is martial arts, especially in the form of MMA. And then we have this idea that we have to be violent, right? But there's a reservation. There's almost like this mental block of like, at to what level can I get up to just be violent enough to where like I don't hurt this person too much, or like I can win without causing too much damage. And I would, I argue, or I will argue that in that space, that holds so many talented people back from being successful. And ultimately, they take away from their own ability to perform. And then they might get hurt worse, or in that, they might hurt somebody worse, right? So, in a lot of times, a lack of commitment in certain practices, right? So if you don't commit, so if I would use just like, let's use like snowboarding, for example, when you talk about learning tricks and stuff like that, not committing to spins and things, right, is a big, or to the flip and half and like bailing out midway is more dangerous than completing that motion, right? So there's a lot of, there's a lot of more dangerous, or a lot even more ways people can get more hurt when they pull themselves back and ultimately hurt themselves, whether it's financially, successfully, their careers as fighters in that space that exists, because they hold themselves from that capacity for violence, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I understand exactly what you mean. I felt it myself in competing in jiu-jitsu, although ironically it is termed a gentle art.
Yeah.
Um, Still, even competing, I felt myself sort of holding back in a way where I'm like, oh, I don't want to necessarily do that to that person's
Hmm.
knee. Or I've even had, um, former memories of destroying people's knees and ankles and whatnot, and it just
Yeah.
flashing back in my brain, mid fight, like, oh no, don't want to hurt that person's leg, and then hold myself back so much that I end up kind of like losing because
Right.
I didn't
Yeah.
bring anything to the table.
And there's this conflict, right? There's this like cognitive dissonance there, and I feel this all the time. I think we talk about it in the jujitsu world. I think you know ad nauseum, to the point of like there's always the story that this black belt or this person with all this experience tells you, like you tell them about, like I just want to quit, I don't want to do this anymore, like I had a terrible day or week and like I don't feel like I really know anything because I just got crushed by this person, by this either this higher belt or this even this newer person. It's like, why am I even doing this? And I hate this because you start to measure yourself based off how well you're might maybe competing in that space, whether it's a training space or whether it's in a truly competitive space where you can see this, you're holding yourself back in certain ways, right? Maybe you're not moving as hard as you can through a maneuver or through a movement, or you're not pulling on an arm as maybe as hard as you could, or you're not pulling that choke or cinching that as strong as you know you are. And then they get away and then they beat you in that position and they don't share that same compassion towards you, right? They don't share that reservation, and then you're getting beat. And then it feels like there's kind of this ego kicks in a little bit of like, well, I'm not being successful in this, but I need to be more violent, right? I need to go harder. Um, to be more successful, but there's a certain level of intensity that we can hold ourselves back from that plays into this like almost this balance we're playing, and we're in our own head and we don't want to do it. And like I have these thoughts all the time coming out of training some days where I feel bad because I absolutely smashed somebody, right? And they could be a higher belt for me or a lower belt or whatever, but the context was we were training and we were training competitively. And pulled myself back, and I feel, or I don't hold myself back in that context, and I feel terrible because I'm like, man, I really just, does that guy think I'm an asshole? Like, am I a jerk because of that? Or the opposite side where, I'm just like, "Ah, I just like, I know I could go harder. I know I can. And I just have this block because I don't want to go too hard. Now I'm going berserk and wearing myself out. And now I'm doing worse because of that. Right. So this balance between this intellectual, analytical, or just kind of a flow state, if you will, and also of being violent and being putting in that kind of effort.
Yeah. Okay. So someone comes to you and they're talented and they're fighter. They're fighting and they're professional fighter or whatever, but they've got this mental block of being violent, let's say, or laying down damage. And this is kind of a side point, but the goggles that I see UFC through, I often see fighters that come from tougher cultures and tougher backgrounds have less mental blockages with being more violent because they're more used to it,
Yeah.
especially if it means like putting food on the table from age 15, for example. That mindset of going in and winning at all costs seems to be, from my perspective, easier to achieve than someone that has perhaps been raised through a collegiate sporting program,
Right.
got into MMA because they're an athlete, and now they have to start breaking people, which is a sort of
Yeah.
mindset they're not familiar with. So back to my question, if someone comes to you with a blockage, mental blockage like that, how do you then work with them in such a fashion to be more violent, I guess?
Well, you touched on a hallmark that helps develop that kind of mentality, right? That's survivalistic. Going back to kind of the animal example, right? And the idea of like cornering an animal that isn't typically violent or usually elusive, they have a great capacity for violence in that survival, with that survival instinct. And when you have somebody who is hungry, who is already comes from that type of lifestyle, or feels that that's what's happening, where you're literally going to take food out of their mouth, where you're literally going to take away um, something from them that is so great and impactful that they are scrapping to survive, right? That can create great opportunities for that person to be violent or be successful in that case. But now the question comes, how do you engender that in somebody who doesn't come from that, who doesn't really have a lot of needs or wants beyond maybe they just have a value as a martial artist to display a skill. They have a value, um, or they have these goals and these passions about displaying, about showing this art, about being a part of it, about the community that it is, where their winning or losing doesn't necessarily have an impact on their quality of life, in the sense of, I will eat tonight, have a place to sleep tonight, take care of my family, um, if they aren't successful, right? So how do you engender that, right? It's a lot of work, and it comes back to the idea that question is, does everybody have a capacity for violence? And I think a lot of it comes out of this idea of context, right? So, first, it's creating a place in which it is okay to be violent, right? So we talked about a little bit the idea of like it's creating a space in which it's okay to fail. So the worry that comes out of teaching violence is that this violence will bleed over into other areas of my life. Now, we know intellectually, if you will, because it's been backed up by a lot of great research, that that's not necessarily true. That if you are violent in one, or if you experience violence in one space of your life, it doesn't always translate over. A great example of that is all the rigmarole, or the the big focus on like violent video games and movies and stuff, and how does this affect children and their behavior, and are they going to be violent because they play violent video games? Well, psychology as a science has proven over and over again that no, it doesn't translate, right? Because there's a context in which they're experiencing and displaying that doesn't change the way they behave in other contexts, right? And to use, honestly, to use a kind of a crass example, think about it this way: like, whether you want to believe it or not, your parents had sex, right? They had sex. They probably had great time. They enjoyed it. They did all kinds of awesome stuff, right, to each other. Things that you don't want to think about. You're like, this is, oh, I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to know that my parents did this. But they did. And that's how you came about. And also, they didn't do it just to make you. They did it because they liked it and they enjoyed it. And here you are, right? But we also see them in the context as parents, so we don't see them as sexual beings when we are in the relationship with them as a family, as a member of that family, right? We don't see them as sexual beings, who, do these things to each other that we might engage with somebody else. We don't want to imagine that. We don't want to think that, but they do. So they don't act in that. They don't act that way in the context of you and your relationship for as a parent to a child. In the same way, you can even look at it from just perspective matters as well, right? It's okay to be, we see violence is okay and even seek that out in the context of fighting. But if we go out onto the street, not way less people are okay with that. And going back to the sex example, if I was dating someone or married to somebody, in a serious enough relationship where we were thinking about having kids, and I go talk to, say, my father-in-law, and I say, "Yeah, I'm just really giving it to your daughter every night. Yeah, we're going for it, right? Yeah, man, it's just every night we find a time and we're just all over each other." And he's like, "That is absolutely just upset, wants to fight me. He's ready to go get his gun." And then I interrupt and say, well, yeah, we're trying. And all of a sudden, oh, that sounds great. Yeah. Man, I'm so happy for you guys that you are trying to have a child so that I can have a grandchild. And suddenly the perspectives change. And the whole idea is suddenly okay and totally appropriate, even though the behaviors didn't change. Right. So, circling back, it's creating this space, context, and a perspective in which being violent is appropriate. Because one thing we need to remember is we've created an arena with rules and with regulations and with boundaries that allow someone to be as violent as they possibly want to be within that context. And at one point, even if you go in there with the idea that I want to kill this person across from me, there is a referee, there's people there to prevent that from happening. And so if being violent is what's going to help you as a martial artist, trying to literally punch somebody in the face so hard that they have a traumatic brain injury and they lose consciousness, or to the point in which they no longer physically can prevent you from hurting them, there's somebody who intervenes. If you can't bring in a certain level of violence, that's going to affect your ability to perform. To create that context, though, it's a lot of work, because, again, not everybody has that capacity.
Yeah, okay. And yeah, it's not a given for everybody.
Right.
The cage environment's very interesting. You and I have both seen it as fans over the years, and also working in that realm where fighters have let off submissions or let off the gas because they didn't want to do any more damage. We saw it
Hmm.
with Sugar Sean.
Yeah.
We talked about this earlier in the week about
Yeah.
how he did actually the opposite, tried to deliver less damage, walked off, didn't finish the fight,
Yeah.
but then sort of had to go back and do more, and arguably ended up doing more damage with his finishing blow on the floor to Almeida than than would have been done if perhaps the ref had stopped. But you do see fighters cross into that boundary of, I don't want to hurt the person maybe too much, when actually, as the rules state, and you hear refs talk about it a lot, is it's up to the referee to intervene and perhaps either pull the fighter off the other one, or literally, put a roadblock of another human body in between the two so that no more damage can occur. And yet, knowing that rule, it's still not intuitive for all the fighters to just go balls to the wall
right.
until they've been pulled off.
And to go a little bit into, I didn't directly answer your question before about how to create that idea. Um, I think it just comes through. It comes through practice. It comes through separating that person, and also having this idea of mutual respect for that other person who is also coming in with the same capacity for violence towards you, right? So we look at what Sean O'Malley did, and because he did that, the perspective is, oh, he's an idiot because he didn't finish that fight. But then we go back to Curtis versus Lewis, right? Curtis Blades versus Lewis, and they say, well, that was ridiculous that Lewis followed up with that shot. Or even when what was it, the knee to Ben Askren, right? And he was clearly out. He had a textbook fencer response. His arms went straight out, and he was out and just almost seizing. And he still got follow up shots, right, from Masvidal. And it was like, well, is that even necessary? And I would even argue that for Masvidal's sake, if he wanted the record for the fastest knockout, if he wouldn't have given him the follow-up shots, he would have gotten an even faster timed one, because they would have done it at the moment probably that he hit the canvas, and that would have been called at that point because he would have walked away from it. But instead, he followed up, and the ref had to jump in and then stop it, added seconds onto that. So, from a purely performance data perspective, he almost handicapped himself there. Um, so we look at that, and there's this like cognitive dissonance on like, well, they need to finish it, right? But then at the same time, they're being criticized when they don't, and they're being criticized when they do, and by leaving it to the ref to intervene in those moments. Um, Building that ability, right, comes from accepting yourself as being capable of violence, right? You have to know that you are a violent person, that you can do harm to other people. And it's kind of the same as, to use an example, and this might lean into some controversial political stuff, but I'm just going to use the idea in a general sense of gun ownership, right? Where there are those who own and respect the ownership of a weapon, right? Where they see it as, they hold it in respect, they hold it in a regard of like, this is something that is a tool, but it is not the first reaction. It is something that I use, that I have a lot of respect for, and also have caution with, right? Responsible gun ownership. And there are people who see it as part of their identity, right? Where like they posture with it, right? Going back to the example of the capacity for violence, where I want to display it on my hip as almost like red feathers or red markings on a poisonous frog. I want people to think I'm more dangerous than I am, right? There's certain, like, what is, I think, a certain type of moths that look like monarch butterflies, because monarchs are poisonous to certain birds, and they copy that, right? It happens in nature all the time. They're not actually dangerous, they're not actually mimicking, but they want you to think they are, because ultimately they have this internal fear, anxiety, or survival instinct of, I need to do this to survive, even if I just want something to believe, or I need to trick it to do that. So using that example of the gun ownership piece, where there's people who are posture that violence, but they're not actually capable of it. And they're not actually accepting themselves as a violent person. They want you to think they're a violent person. And we see this in interviews, right? We see a lot of this posturing in martial arts interviews, where you have people saying that, oh, I'm going to do this to this person. I'm going to take everything they have. I'm going to beat the crap out of them and like take their arm home with me, and all these kinds of threats. And then a lot of times the person sitting across there that is actually the more reasonable, just like, no, I'm going to go over there and, I'm going to give them a good fight. I'm going to do this. I'm going to be true to what I'm training, is the one who sometimes ends up being more violent, right? Francis Ngannou is an extremely violent fighter. He hits hard, and there's no, I couldn't, I couldn't tell you just through observation that there's any reservation in any punch that he throws at the person across from the ring from him. And at the same time, he doesn't speak like a violent person. He carries himself very, very respectfully. Even after the Stipe fight that just happened, you hear him speak about people are in interviews that, right, they want a story out of that, so they're kind of goading him into speaking about this idea of this, like, oh, what have you taken from him, and look what you did to him, and like, how do you feel about that? And he's like, I didn't take anything from him. Like, he still has this legacy as a great fighter. I have nothing but respect for him. I hope him a fast recovery and everything. And both of those individuals being what I would consider probably more stoic and respectful fighters in a space where a lot of people like to create a persona that they are maybe something more than they are. Um, Both of them just had nothing but mutual respect after the fact. So, do we need to posture as much to be as violent? So, there's those who are capable and those who want you to believe they are capable. And crossing the line from that belief to expressing that is where a lot of that work starts.
Fascinating. So it starts with an acceptance, which I guess is an internal practice on its own. That's an insight in itself where you have to do the internal work of accepting the fact that you're capable of great violence. I don't know who the quote is associated to, but and I'm going to butcher it, but it's something along the lines of a good man is not a harmless man. A good man is a man who's has a potential for great violence. He just
Mhm.
has it under control. And I I strongly agree with that from the martial arts perspective. So they've done the work, let's say, to accept that they are capable of great violence. They've accepted that. They've gone away and done the homework there to make that happen. How do they then translate that into bringing it out? Because in our last show, you talked very articulately about creating a scenario where you what you want to have happen versus what you don't want to have happen, and focusing the mind on what you do want to have happen in a sports psychology and performance psychology context. Once someone's accepted they're violent or capable of it, how do they then go to the next stage of bringing that into what they want to see happen?
I would say in a similar what you just described, right? This approach versus avoidance mentality, where you see harming somebody else. Because let's back up to the idea of what is success in martial arts, right? Especially in MMA, particularly in MMA and UFC, right? Or in most fighting arenas. Winning is incapacitating, harming, submitting the person across from you, right? You have to be violent to be successful. And ultimately, both people who walk into that space, I would say for the most part, right, are there to win, to be successful, one or the other. So that immediately, it's like, I want to be successful, right? I want to approach or bring myself closer to this success, which is winning in that space, which means that now I have to know that, what do I want to do? How do I be successful in that space? All right, so I have to hit them a certain way. I have to make them move a certain way in which I can hit them, or control them in a way in which I can get them to stop, right? Through submission, through whatever. So when you have a reservation of, I'm worried about hurting this person, you are immediately putting yourself into a fixed, avoidant headspace. Because now I am focusing on what I don't want to do instead of what I do want to do, or what I want to have happen, or the behaviors that culminate into the outcome that I wish to have, right? Now, there are people who definitely they look for at least, and try to find a balance in which they are doing everything they can to win, but also to cause the least amount of harm, right? Um, which I feel like is always an uphill battle. And there are those who are very capable of doing that, and being successful still, but they still do cause harm. And I would argue that the amount of harm they cause actually um, is can be more at times, because they might hold back or hit the person more because they aren't hitting them as hard or as they aren't moving as fast or ending it as quickly as they could, right? So this approach versus avoidant mentality is applied in this same position, right? This just comes in a territory that is a lot more, what you could argue is controversial. It comes with um, a lot more challenging to our kind of natural being, that is our capacity for violence or not. And I would say that you approach it the same way. You want these outcomes to have happen. If I'm thinking about how much I might hurt somebody when I'm trying to hit them, I'm not focusing on being technically profound martial artists. I'm not focusing on winning these moments, which is winning these rounds, which is winning that fight. I'm putting myself in a position to be avoidant of something I don't want to have happen, which is going to put you in a very fixed space in which your performance is going to suffer. And ultimately, you are going to cause yourself more damage. And that little bit of you're taking in a way, um, you're being less compassionate towards yourself and about what you want by being overly compassionate, or I would say contextually inaccurately compassionate to the other person, because you're worried about their well-being, which is now changing your behavior. So you're not expressing yourself or acting in a way that would be your best self in that performance. And so that, what I would call misplaced compassion, is going to take away from your performance and affect your ability to win in that moment.
Isn't it funny that our natural instincts could put us into a position of a fixed avoidant mindset in the context of fighting?
Yeah,
The natural urge of "I don't want to hurt so and so" can actually work to your detriment. You brought up the word compassion there,
yeah.
which is very interesting and not often associated in the same sentence as violence, especially being compassionate about being violent. So it's fair to say then you're actually misplacing your compassion if you're holding back in your approach to violence in the context of, for lack of a better term, a mixed martial arts fight. What, in that case, then, is the most compassionate approach you can take to being violent? Is it just simply the opposite? Go in there and just do everything you can to destroy the person? Or what's the sort of way that you coach your guys and girls to take a more compassionate approach to themselves and to the person that they're fighting um, in that sort of violent context?
Well, look at it. What is the difference between the success of one person versus the other, right? If I am very worried about hurting that person, and that ends up to my loss or my inability to perform, which would lead to a loss, right? Or could lead to a loss. Where is where I'm placing that, a level of compassion towards myself, right? And then I have people who rely on me, and I'm speaking of me in the general context. I have people who rely on me. I might have a partner. I have a gym that maybe I run, and my success actually can lead to the well-being of the people who work there and the students who participate there. Um, I have bills. I want to, but maybe this fight, the difference between making half versus the entire pay is going to be a difference of what I can do to support myself and then my kids and then their future, or other people that I take care of. So by worrying about that person in that context and those singular moments, I've now taken away from my ability to alleviate the suffering, right? One of the definitions of compassion of those who rely on me, and then also my self compassion towards myself. So I'm allowing myself to get hurt worse, which is going to affect my ability to perform after the fact, how I can take care of those around me. And so by placing that compassion towards the person in front of me, um, I am hurting a lot of other people that are important to me. Now, you could flip it on me. You could say the same thing, that well, if you hurt them and they lose, what about that same context, or the same tribe of people that you just talked about within yourself or with that person that they have? Absolutely. You're right. And we have a choice to who do we place that on, right? And also, I would argue that there's a higher level of compassion. The idea of when we look at martial arts, when we look at war, at battle, at what it really means to be a warrior in that space, because you both signed up to be there, right? This isn't a street fight of survival in which, you know what, like, I already knocked the guy down. There's no winners here. I don't need to end a person's life because this is a drunk scuffle or this is an unnecessary thing. We both signed a contract to walk into this space, to participate in this sport. We made a lot of choices as a fighter, especially once you get all the way up to the level of UFC. You've been doing it for a while, and you've made this choice to be a violent person, to be a martial artist. And I think one of the most disrespectful things that you can do for your opponent is not show up with the same intent that they might have for you, which is to win through, in the context of that sport and that the expression of that martial art, with the same ferocity, capacity of violence, and showing up your best self. So if bringing out your violent self is becomes your best self in that performance, and then you don't bring that out, you are being disrespectful and you are not being compassionate towards them as a martial artist, because you aren't coming at them in the same with the same level of, or with what they expect out of you, and that they might be coming at you with too. And we see this all the time. Extremely violent fights, right? There's tons of examples in the UFC alone where people are just, they just throw technique out the window and they just scrap, and there's the just they joke in MMA, right? The just bleed gods are just loving it, right? And um at the end they embrace each other, and there's nothing but love in that space, right? And you just like, I mean, some people look at that like, are they crazy? Like, they just beat the crap out of each other and they're here over here hugging, because they have are a part of a culture and a part of a lifestyle in which violence is a part, one of the expressions of martial art, right? Um, the whole term martial art is partially is meaning violent art, right? And seeing that, it's that's a level of compassion that goes beyond what I would call our traditional definitions, because in that context, they're extending that to that person, that we are both going to show up as our best selves. We are both coming in here to try to kill each other. And when the moment passes in which that person can no longer express that, right? They can no longer fight back. We have that mutual respect where that's how I become a compassionate martial artist. And that there's a person in there to pull me out of that space in which we can, do this another day.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the sportsmanship shown in combat sports, and some collision sports too, as well. It's always been a real positive ending to a perhaps graphic storyline. I think it's really important. What's fascinating about that is it takes your own experience really to empathize with it. I think, like, if
Yeah.
you've done martial arts, you get it. But there's something about violence which is a great leveler, in the sense that when it's practiced amongst two consenting people in the format of a gym, for example, and you know this, the camaraderie that is built amongst your training partners is a very unique camaraderie. I've had friends in all sorts of sports that I've played and taken part in, from traditional to extreme and in between. But something about the martial practice develops a bond between my training partners that is very unique. And the irony is that friendship is built around beating the shit out of each other,
Yeah.
which is bizarre on paper, but when you experience it, it's fascinating. I know you had a bit of a pop culture reference to Fight Club on that point.
Well, for sure. I mean, that's a great example. We had talked about Fight Club earlier, and um, I mean, there's so many scenes in it that really highlight this, where you have these people coming from their lives, right, in the movie, that um, their lives are just, they're drones. They hate their bosses. They just have this severe lack of control in their life, right? This locus of control is completely outside of their being, or outside of the circle in which they can influence it, meaning that it's in their boss's hands, their wife's hands, the partner, whomever. And then they all meet in this basement, right? And they brutally bare knuckle beat the crap out of each other to the point of hurting each other. Now, this is a movie, right? And they're sensationalizing this idea, but I don't think it's sensationalized as some people might believe, because as you and I know, even just on the jujitsu mat, the people that when you have a partner that you go and try to literally, like, we're slapping hands, like, look at each other, like, we're gonna try to kill each other today, right? Yep. And then afterwards you're like, that was awesome, right? These guys get up from these fights in this movie and they embrace each other and they're all smiling and everyone's cheering for both of them. There's no winners, there's no losers. Like, they don't even keep track of that there. And in the bigger picture of the movie, like, what this characters are doing, the creators of the Fight Club, right? So the Tyler Durden, right? He's creating this environment in which these people are being empowered. They are building these bonds. They are finding control again in their life, because they're being put in a position, in a place, in a fight, right? That their effort is the only thing that matters. Their ability to fight is the only variable that matters. And then the other person. And so it simplifies their lives so much that this space of violence becomes the most invigorating and the best expression of themselves in that context. So it's funny to see that happen. And in the same, I mean, I know you have too. I've had experiences with, I have a particular black belt that I train with. His name's Curtis Hill. He's, you know, years, decades of experience. And he calls me out on it all the time that I am not violent enough. I don't put in that a lot. And what he'll do is, at times, with control, right? He's not going to let me get hurt, but he will put me in positions in which I feel like I'm going to, that I have to react in a way that is up to that potential to get him off of me. An example of that is not necessarily respecting a tap all the time on a choke, right? Especially on when we're looking at gi and you're in a space being asphyxiated, right? And what he will call me out on is, I'll tap and he'll be like, "No, you can get out." And I go into a panic and I find this strength and suddenly I do escape legitimately. Like, he's not letting me out, and I get out under my own control, under my own efforts. And what that shows me is that I do have more. And when we have these scraps where we'll just go after each other, and to the point of he finally brings it out of me and we're really trying to hurt each other in the context of jujitsu, right? We're not striking anything like that. Afterwards, I have nothing but love for that person. And I can't tell you why necessarily, right? Because I'm speaking of my own experience, but I know what I feel. And I know that I'm not the only one, and we see it being a part of that community. I see it in my conversations as a professional and a consultant with fighters, that this is not only invigorating, but it's their best lives or the best versions of themselves. So it's funny to think of that we have this lack of capacity for violence naturally, but when it's expressed in a way that, if you will, is allowed, um, it suddenly brings out a higher level of well-being from us.
Yeah, a great, almost Lao Tzu kind of irony to the mystics of the mystical aspects of life. I think it's fascinating. Who would have thought that within violence is all the information you need to become a better person? Who would have thunk it? Um, Martial arts, though, that's the power of them, or at least jujitsu and a couple of the other really effective ones. It can bring that out of you, and I think that's just fantastic. It's you're getting leveled and you're getting beaten up, and yet
Yeah.
it can bring out an inner beast in you which can empower you and make you better and stronger, and at the end of it you can thank the very person that brought it out of you,
Mhm.
in a way that you can't really express in another setting.
Well, even think of it too, the truth of it all, right? We're always seeking truth. A lot of our a lot of our anxieties about the world, whether it was over this last year, the political climates, whatever reasons or whatever things are going on, we naturally do not feel comfortable with ambiguity, right? We don't. It creates a lot of anxiety in ambiguity, unknowns, right? That's a lot of what leads into pre-performance anxiety in that micro sense. And in a macro sense, right? It came out in history of us creating the pantheons of gods to explain all these natural events because I didn't know what lightning was. I didn't understand what these big booms were or the changes in weather and the giant waves that came sometimes, but not others. So I had to find a tangible thing to place it on, right? Remove the mystery and find a truth, the veracity of it. And then, um, in the context of martial arts or in fighting, is you can't lie in that space. I can't lie about who I am and what I know when somebody is truly challenging my ability to perform. I can't. I can tell you that I'm going to armbar you, I'm going to punch you in the face, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. And then you go and destroy me, and I did none of that. So nothing I said mattered. Nothing I said I was going to do mattered anymore because the the mat, we they say this a lot, right? The mat is the one of the most honest spaces you can be. And the ring is too. All of the buildup, all of the talking, all of the media, that's for the benefit of the hype, right? Because there's money involved in marketing and things like that. But no matter what either person says, when they close that cage door, that's their truth. They can no longer pretend to be that person anymore, right? What's that? His name is escaping me right now, but the one welterweight who kind of loves to be hated and be contrarian to
Colby?
what's that? Colby Covington, right? So the persona that he has made, in which he has actually not so shyly explained to people that it is a persona, right? It doesn't matter that he is conservative and voted for Trump or blah blah blah. However you fall in line with that or not, it doesn't matter because he has to go fight now, and his fists don't have political statements on them. It's just him fighting, right? It's his training now. All of his effort, all of his work on whether it's his physical, his mentality, or whatever, is now laid bare in that space. All of that buildup, and a lot of times you see it in ways that are very not fun to watch, right? And other times it lives up to the hype, but that's completely incidental. I don't know if you agree with this, but I think it's completely incidental that when the hype and the talk leads into uh, comes out the same way in the fight. And only I think it's not incidental when they are being true, when they are being honest the entire way through, or when the portrayal of that person, of those fighters, is being honest the way through. But to round it back up, you can't lie in that space. And that's why I think there's a lot of, in the chaos of our lives and the ambiguity that we constantly live in, there's a reason why we love that space.
Yeah, like you say, we're seeking truth whether we know it or not, and the opposite of a truth is a lie. So it makes sense if we want truths, let's get rid of the lies first as
Right.
a starting point, and start our quest for objective truths, and from there, absolutely fascinating. Yeah, it's remarkable, and I never would have thought consciously that having an acceptance level towards being violent would enable me to actually be my better self, encourage others to become their better selves, and at the end of it we can all have a beer and thank each other for bringing out
Yeah.
a 2.0 version of where we were before. I think that is just a testament to the beauty of training to be really violent people. Joey, I want to pick your brains a little bit more on the other side of the violence. We've talked about the person delivering it.
Uh-huh.
Fantastic. But what about the poor bugger that gets flying kneed and then is starched and then is signed off for 6 months with a head injury or brain trauma
Yeah.
or concussions and stuff like that? Now I know you're pretty well equipped in the sort of scientific realm and the understanding of what kind of goes on when the brain gets rattled and all that. I thought maybe we could dive a little bit into the sort of the brain degeneration you were talking about recently and kind of what's going on that side of things. Maybe even recently with Curtis Blades and getting the uppercut there from the black beast to the human truck. That's going to hurt. That's going to hurt the brain.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's dive into a little bit on the sort of the neuro side of things.
Yeah. I mean, specifically, I guess when you're looking at, I mean, I actually think we can really bridge this, right, with the violent part, and meaning that the idea of like concussive blows and subconcussive blows and how that leads into trauma is extremely important in fighting, right? And then when we look at the context of fighting and we talk about everything we just talked about, right? The idea of compassion versus not, and then the ugly side of it is that there are those who walk away from the sport and retire with long-term damage. And whether that is through expressed later in life through neurodegenerative diseases like CTE, dementia, Alzheimer's, what have you, right? And that is an unfortunate reality. Um, what is more unfortunate is that there is a means to prevent a lot of that through educating um, this field and through bringing this science more into it, right? So what's awesome is, and what a lot of the fight clubs do, right? The UFC does this. I know Bellator does for sure. LFA even has a budget for this, where post fight, if somebody is knocked out or even receives any type of injury, they will support them financially through that medical recovery. And so, for example, like you said, um, I will say in a general sense, because I won't say exactly who, just because of HIPAA and things like that. But um, Curtis was able to, the UFC, I know for sure, would pay for him to go to a concussion clinic to do, or a concussion clinic, or to see certain doctors in his purview that would, in that purview on the neuroscience side, to help him with that recovery. So, what's more though is there are means to prevent and to also um, a preventative sense, right? A proactive way to prevent head injury, as well as a way to recover in which you recover fully. And that gets kind of into the idea, a little bit into the weeds of an idea that's I spent a lot of time researching and expressing through when I worked with a concussion. So I worked with a concussion program, doing research with them and doing recovery with them, and individuals who had come to us, whether they had a recent concussion or they had a lifetime of expressive of that, right? So I digress. In that, I learned about this idea of what's called neuromechanical coupling, right? So, neuromechanical coupling, in a layman's sense, is simply the ability for your reaction to a stimulus to translate into a movement or a counter reaction. In the context of fighting, right? In MMA, boxing, any sport, we're trying to knock each other out. Um, that starts to find its way into our experience in the idea of what we call a glass jaw, right? So, in a very quick explanation, right? When I get hit in the face or I get hit anywhere in the head, um, what happens inside my head is my brain bounces back, can bounce back and forth, and that's called a coup and counter coup, right? And in that space, there's basically an overload. Think of it like a circuit breaker. Too much electricity comes down the line, the circuit breakers flick, and then the whole thing shuts off. And a reaction of this overload, and that's the unconsciousness we see in the event of a concussive blow. By definition, when you lose consciousness after a strike, you have had a concussion. Now, what happens where neuromechanical coupling comes into play is in the sense of, again, getting punched in the face. When I feel that impact, the natural reaction is that the muscles in my neck stiffen to lessen the rotation of my head, right? That's something that's built naturally into us as a reaction. Um, what we see a lot is people training their neck strength and doing all types of exercise. And you and I talked about that a bit, right? So, to like, hey, is that the best way to prevent this? It doesn't matter how strong your neck is if there's a delay. So, what can happen is, and the unfortunate part is, you don't have to get knocked out for this to happen, right? There is an idea of sub-concussive burden where over time, subsequent hits, even small ones, little hits over time, start to lessen or weaken that signal. Where from that delay between I feel an impact and I react to snap my head, it doesn't just come out all when getting punched in the face, right? You see it a lot in whiplash injuries where someone falls backwards and their head snaps, but other people keep their head, they train themselves to keep their head tucked, right? You see it in snow sports where they learn to keep their head tucked when they tumble, things like that, so they don't whip their head around. How we learn break falls, right, in martial arts and jujitsu is tucking our chins so that we don't get that whiplash and we strengthen our necks. Um, but what happens is over time, these subconcussive blows and these burdens build up, and now that signal is now getting, it's a little slower in the uptake. So now that The stiff hit now becomes it becomes a little bit lesser of a reaction, so that now it's later, which means that the brain moves a little more. Maybe that doesn't knock you out. Now you take more hits, more you go down, you get dropped hard, you get hit hard, and you don't go out yet. But now that signal starts to get, it's like it's almost like, think of it like you take a cable, like a data cable, and you just start twisting it. At first, there's no signal degradation. It's still strong. It's still insulated. In a while, those wires start to fray. And then that fraying causes a little bit of a delay, and not as much information gets through as fast. And then it gets a little bit more and a little bit more. And eventually, it gets to the point where every time you get hit, your head moves so much like you got hit by a truck versus getting hit by someone just taps you, right? You don't even get touched hard. We see it um, where it looks like the smallest hit and someone just gets, because they get caught right on the chin. And one of the, now I'm not going to speak to this to the level of that a neuroscientist can, but it's not, there's the theory, the idea is that there's a bundle of nerve fibers that sends a signal and helps with the overload that comes through our chin. The other part of it though is simply torque. Your chin is one of the farthest points away, if you measure obviously like from your neck, where when you get hit right on the chin, that creates the most amount of torque before you can react. So that creates the biggest coup counter coup when you hit somebody, which is why the chin is such a desirable place to strike someone if you wish to knock them out. So they developed that, and they developed this glass chin, right? And so they are very susceptible to uh, concussive blows, where they're getting knocked out a lot because they've built up this subconcussive burden. So with that, right, the good news is that you can detrain this. You can actually strengthen that neuromechanical coupling, and through a through certain exercises, through proactive work, through reactive to anytime I take hits, or anytime, or just doing this as part of your daily routine to help strengthen the system, you actually can prevent um, serious outcomes later, because you're not going to, that subconcussive burden never gets to the point in which you are getting knocked out so severely to receive that traumatic brain injury. A really good example of why this matters is there's a reason you see more neurodegenerative diseases express themselves in linebackers, linemen, you know, running backs in the NFL than you do with receivers and cornerbacks and obviously kickers and things like that. Because think of how often these individuals are getting hit every play, right? So you might have the receiver that gets knocked out every now and then because they take a huge hit, or the cornerback that just lowers for a tackle and they take a head to head, and it's pretty traumatic. But they're not taking those hits every single play, whereas linemen are literally smashing their faces and heads together every play, even with good form, right? They're still meeting face mask, and there's still a little jerk every time, and that running back runs into a freaking wall every time, right? That linebacker is running in to plug a hole almost every single play, 80 plus times a night, like for every game, and then go into practice and do the same thing. So their subconcussive burden is so much higher, meaning that any major traumatic event is going to have a lot larger impact on their health and well-being. And so I'll kind of pause there because I went through a lot.
No,
Um, yeah,
absolutely. So essentially, subconcussive blows delay the coupling response.
it,
And in the
yeah.
delayed coupling response, it kind of compounds itself. Like the more subconcussive blows you get, the worse it gets. Is that fair to say?
Um, I would think of it just as it weakens the coupling, right? So
Weakens it.
it builds that subconcussive burden, is the term, to the point in which um, you have worse outcomes when you receive what would be a traumatic blow. Um, the paper that supports this, right, was written by one of my former bosses. His name is Dr. Pressmack, and a couple of other individuals who work with the Olympic Training Center, and they helped create the study around this, looking more specifically at the relationship the between that subconcussive burden, right, the neuromechanical coupling, and then actually extremity injuries, right? So individuals who had received subconcussive burden, meaning they never were knocked out, right? They never were actually like getting concussions by definition. That's why I mean term subconcussive, right? But they had a high subconcussive burden, meaning that they actually ended up having more extremity injuries, meaning that they were more likely to tear an ACL. They are more likely to fall and break a wrist, right? Because they're falling down more often. So for some reason, it was like, why am I falling so much? I'm an Olympic athlete. I'm trained my body, my reaction times, and everything. Because when you take them out of a controlled environment, right, and you actually have them have to perceive a stimulus, make a reaction, whether it's implicit or explicit, about that stimulus, that delay now turns into I didn't plant my foot as fast as I should have, and I'm rolling over that ankle or putting that knee in stress. I didn't turn and torque my body in the right way to be able to counteract the centrifugal force as I was turning or planting to cut through a field or something like that, right, on the field. And then I'm falling over more often, or I'm tripping, or I see something coming at me and I don't step fast enough. And then they start to get all these other extremity injuries. So it really showed it was a very clever way to show the relevance and the importance of that. Hey, you don't have to be knocked out and have a concussion to develop neurodegenerative responses. And the first neurodegenerative response being, or an example, or leading to that being this neuromechanical coupling degradation.
The extremity injuries is interesting, isn't it? I don't know if you heard about Darren Till pulled out of the fight against Vittori yesterday. He
Yeah.
broke his collarbone, and he put in his sentence, "I fell and I broke my collarbone during training." I wonder if that fall was induced by what you just explained, basically. I
I
wonder
yeah, I could only speculate, right?
for
Because
sure.
we see these weird injuries sometimes, especially in
Yeah,
MMA, like Tony
yeah,
Ferguson tripping over an extension cord, tearing his AC. I think he tore his MCL or ACL, right, from an extension cord, and the guy does crazy things to his body, and you're like, how did that hurt him? And it's in the weirdest ways. And we see it all the time. Like we go in the gym, we roll, we might even ride motorbikes and stuff, and it's like, oh yeah, I fell tripping up a curb, and you're like, how you do all these hyper
yeah.
athletic things, and all of a sudden you're like, how is this happening? And that, no, very well, that could be just a funky. They're maybe doing MMA practice, and he didn't he knew he had to do something the right way, or had that training and that muscle memory, but that slight delay means maybe he posted his arm weird, or maybe he wasn't able to protect himself as fast and someone fell or whatever. I don't know exactly how he got injured, but I'm just speculating and saying that this thing obviously matters. And there's so many, one, anecdotal, and it's also been proved, through academic means, that this is something that exists and it matters.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's fascinating how it relates to more than what we first thought, more than just concussions and sitting in a dark room for a month. But there's a lot more going on. Now, you mentioned just now that there's preventative
Yeah.
measures that you can do, and also post concussive sort of treatments too. What does your understanding of the preemptive measures look like? What sort of like, it doesn't seem like it's an intuitive area of training per se, because this is all coming out as being quite new with all the research and stuff. What sort of stuff are fighters, especially, or
Mhm.
collision sports athletes doing to kind of maintain decent levels of that coupling you were talking about?
Right, and that's a great question, because it doesn't seem, like you said, it doesn't seem intuitive. It's actually something that um, our brains are very capable of doing. And one of the physical things is called dual task processing, right? So dual task processing just simply means that I'm both engaging my motor functioning, but at the same time engaging my executive functioning, right? So like thinking about something. A very plain example is I'm going to run on a treadmill while I'm going to run or walk on a treadmill and play chess on a pad in front of me, right? I'm doing something with a lot of executive functioning, a lot of planning, a lot of while at the same time while I'm running and doing a motor function. So when you engage both of those, right, it's just the same way as creating adaptation for different types of movements, right? You're almost strengthening, or we would say myelinating, right? So insulating that ability to speak between the mothership and the rest of the body. And another a way that we will see this come out in a more contextual sense is doing different types of activities, right? Like balancing on one foot while throwing a ball against the wall and having to catch it, right? So that is motor function, but there is a planning and tracking that has to happen where you're separating two functions, right? I'm trying to tap my head and run my belly at the same time, and that helps with strengthening those signals. And so another way that a lot of the research, so going back to that paper, neuromechanical coupling, a lot of the research that looks at it now uses things like light boards. So you have this big light board in front of you. There's one version that's called Dynavision. There's a lot more. Again, as this research is exploding, there's all these crazy like touch boards that are coming out and stuff. But really, what they lead you up to is you have these lights in your peripheral in which you see this pop up and you have to reach and tap a light. And at the same time, they build up to first, I'm just doing this as fast as I can. I see a light, I reach, I tap, I'm just doing this. And then eventually they lead into now I have to read while I'm doing it. So a sentence is going across the screen in this little blue screen in front of you. Especially this is I'm speaking specifically to Dynavision, but I'm reading the screen while at the same time I'm using my peripherals. So I'm engaging in a motor function while also executive function where I'm reading that executive function task. Um, Again, and that helps insulate, strengthen that neuromechanical coupling, or helps with the recovery from that subconcussive burden. Now, the problem with just the physical intervention, right, is that that's great. There's a lot of ways I can come up with dual task processing as a rehabilitation piece. Another preventative measure is just diet, right? So reducing the amount of things in your diet that cause inflammation. We love sugar, right? It's part of it's especially in Western diets. It's part of everything. I love sugar. I have to hold myself off of it. Um, not for the preventative side of the brain side, but because it's just I have a sweet tooth. I always have. But that's beneficial for me to stay off of it, right? Because a lot of times what happens when you have a traumatic event in your brain is that it becomes hyperglycemic, meaning that it starts to eat sugar, it starts to crave sugar a lot. You hear a lot of anecdotal stories of post-concussion or post-serious like TBI. People talk about craving sugar and craving carbs and things like that. So that craving, that desire for it actually doesn't, it kind of puts your brain in, I don't have the term off the top of my head and I don't want to use the wrong one and have someone just come on and be like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. But basically, it's that hyperglycemia can cause nerve death, right? So it actually helps break nerves down faster, increasing kind of the neurodegeneration in that moment that happens with cell death, just like you get scratched or cut and those cells die in the same way. That traumatic impact and that concussive blow can cause that cell death, right? So diet does matter, right? Eating something like having a diet that is less inflammatory. There's certain supplements that are very helpful with that, like curcumin, zinc, magnesium. Amongst others. This is definitely someone hearing this can go look at what is like simply searching neuroprotective supplements, right? So, and I would implore them to look into the research itself to see which ones actually have research to back them up versus somebody trying to sell you a supplement that may or may not. But those things, there's a lot of dietary pieces and supplements that have neuroprotective, meaning that it actually helps your ability to recover quicker, right? In the same way that if I get a cut and I'm eating like crap and I have a crap immune system because I'm not sleeping well and I'm doing all these other behavioral dietary things, it's not going to heal as fast. Right. Or I get an infection and it doesn't go away as fast because my immune system is busy doing other things. Right. Because it's trying to bring this inflammation down in this one area and not attacking and not helping with the inflammation in my brain or that cut in my arm or that skin infection or whatever. So it all of those things matter and can be neuroprotective as well as reactionary after the fact. A big one that is recommended, and I know that there are doctors in the NFL specifically that will recommend post-concussion or concussive, like when they're going through concussion protocol, they put their athletes on a keto diet, right? So zero sugar, very high fat, right? Your brain's made of fatty acids. So putting them on omega fatty acids, um, very high fat diet to basically just flood your body with the material that it needs to break down to reconstruct and rebuild your brain. Um, the other piece, going back a little bit to the physical intervention, right, as being preventative with the dual task processing, is that it does help with the release of a chemical in your brain called BDNF, or brain derived neurotropic factor, which is essentially seen as a like miracle grow for neuro for nerve growth, right? So it helps with growing new growing new brain cells and grow and helping with the density of that and increasing the capacity, right, of your brain. And that's backed up by tons of research, right? So the research specifically looking at people in memory care facilities that are aged and older, they put them through different types of exercises, right? So looking at they put them through dual task processing type ones. They put them through like hit training, which sounds crazy to have an old folks home doing hit, but it's not the same as we think of hit when you walk into a CrossFit gym or something like that, where we have 80-year-old grandmas tossing around kettlebells and doing kip pull-ups and stuff like that, which would be very entertaining to see, and I'm sure that's a very successful facility. But um, we see that they actually have a recovery from a lot of those that neurodegeneration or those neurodegenerative diseases. Like they come out of their dementia a little bit. They have effects on Alzheimer's. They have effects on other types of neurodegenerative diseases, right? So this stuff matters. And going back to the fight world, is it hasn't eked itself enough in there, right? It hasn't come in strong enough into that world yet, which is to me a travesty, and it really needs to find its way in. It's something that when I'm around any of these fighters, right, they if I see if a lot of the coaches will actually be like, hey Joey, can you talk to this person about what they need to do, they took a big hit in training or something like that. And I love that we have that culture, that I am a part of that culture at Elevation. And I have, friends and other clients outside of fighting that will, in the same sense, reach out to me for the same resource. But in fighting, there's a cultural issue in which I think a lot of people don't want to know, right? They just want to fight. I'm just here for this thing, and this extra thing here, this monkey on my back, I'm just going to pretend it's not there. As long as I don't feel bad, and as long as I don't know that my brain is taking all this damage, I don't want to be proactive, because that means I have to accept that it's going to happen, right? That I'm going to take this damage. And so I think there's a resistance to that, because in the same way that psychology, right, from my perspective, working with anybody in performance psychology is still seen at times as, oh, you're only going to this mental coach or whatever because you're weak in some way. There's something wrong with you, right? Where it's like, no, just like you do physical, and you're a strength and conditioning coach, right? There are physical exercises and warm ups and stuff that are protective, that make you stronger in ways that prevent injury. And that to say, like, oh, I don't need to stretch and cool down. And you're like, yes, you do, because like stretching and cool down is just a waste of time and weak. I'm just here to get strong. Well, you're not going to get as strong as you can if you don't actually take recovery and proactive, you know, proactive work seriously. And it's
Yeah,
unfortunate.
yeah, it is unfortunate. It comes back to the machoism, survival of the fittest culture, which is somewhat entrenched, isn't it, in the fight world, last man standing kind of
Right.
approach, which is sort of the old school method. I think it's going to come into
Unfortunately.
light more and more, with the likes of UFC PI and stuff like that, who they can get money behind it, get it into the
Yeah.
limelight, see it in action, and then the process rinse and repeats until it's a bit more of a household.
It's pretty cool. I've been to the Performance Institute, and I got the privilege of training there. I went out. It was around this time last year, earlier in March. I went out there. So Neil Magny was fighting and Austin Hubbard were fighting, and that was the big. Was it Zhang Weili? Am I pronouncing that right? Versus Joanna, and then the very lackluster performance of the main event is Azanyana and Romero, right? But I was out there for that fight in Vegas right before everything shut down. So thankfully I got to experience that. But I went out to the Performance Institute with a few guys from the team and I trained a little bit. Just did some jujitsu and rolling with Cory, with Dober, and one of his coaches, a wrestling coach, Dave. And so I worked at this company called Resilience Code right before that for a couple of years, and we actually had a good relationship with the UFC, and a lot of the concussion work that I did was sometimes with fighters, right? They would come to us, and the UFC would pay for that for the approach that we did with our recovery center, right? As part of the whole bigger guise of what Resilience Code did. And what's funny is the relationship with the UFC and between those two companies was a lot of what the UFC went on to do in the Performance Institute um, was influenced by what Resilience Code was trying to do as well. Um, and it was kind of cool to see a lot of that there. And so, I mean, I saw a Dynavision board. They had fit lights and things like that that all go into a lot of this proactive work. They have a doctor there. And if you're spending a lot of time at the Performance Institute, I think they definitely encourage a lot of proactive, work, especially in that side, which is awesome. I also have a funny story that's completely out of context here, and um, feel free to completely cut this out if you want. But at that facility, um, I there's a lot of other people there, and I actually almost got what I felt was I almost got knocked out by Ngannou while I was there, right? So we're going to the locker room and we're changing, and then all of these like the who's who of the UFC is here, right? Because there's a fight in town, and a lot of these guys are training there, and I think a lot of guys do train almost full time at the institute. Well, Francis walks right in next to me and starts changing next to me, and I swear if he would have turned fast enough, he would have just knocked me out. Because being from where he's from, he's very comfortable with himself and his body. And I'm just there trying to change as fast as I can. And I'm not an out of shape person, but I'm definitely felt a little self conscious in the space of all these great professional athletes. And he's just, in his birthday suit, just changing and chatting it up with guys. And I mean, a couple times, the hammer almost swung and caught me in the chin. So being at the Performance Institute was a little more dangerous than I thought it would be, but that was that was definitely outside of that, definitely a fun
That's it. Yeah,
experience.
have to get on
Cool
the light
facility.
board just to get your clothes back on. Do you know what I mean?
Right, yeah.
On the dual task processing side of
Yeah.
things, Joey, is there a progressive element to it? Like, is the goal to try and get more lights in less time, or more complex sentences read whilst 100% accuracy on the lights, or is it just a case of you just got to do the task at hand? It doesn't necessarily matter about making it harder. Do you know about that
Yes.
side of things?
That is a great question because the research around it, obviously you want to reduce variables so that you're able to see the influence of which variables were the dependent, independent, things like that. Um, Now, the reading part of it was uh, always random sentences from, oh, what book was it? It's a book about a wolf, and like it's a story from the perspective of the wolves. Um, I can't remember the name of it, but it was always the same book, and they always pulled the same sentences out of it. And the reason they use that book is because of the way the writer wrote. And I want to look this up in a second here, who it was because it's important. But the cadence and the speed of the text across the screen was static, and the amount of time that you did that was also static. And so the pace of the lights, there was two different tests. There was proactive, right, meaning that I am the light will only change when I touch the light, and then it'll immediately, instantaneously become a light on a different area of the board, whether it's next to my hand or whether it's on the opposite side. And then there was reactive, meaning that you had, I think it was 0.5 or 0.75 seconds, right? A half a second or a quarter of a second to find the light on the board and strike it before it changed, right? So the metrics are that for the first one simply be how many did you hit in that time period, and then the second one would be how many that you saw and how many that you struck, right? So now if you strike them faster, if you hit it, it will instantaneously change in the reactive as well. So you can still get insanely high scores on both. But the reactive being that there's this added stipulation of time where like it will go away once it'll show so many in a minute if you never touched it at all. And it's in 60 seconds. So um, yeah, so that context is go back to the question that you asked. Sorry, I was explaining it
Yeah, well,
more,
just
but you said, yeah,
that it's progressive. Like, I
yeah,
mean, S&C is about
yeah.
linear progression or various methods of
So it's
getting stronger. So
there it is.
it's
Yeah.
progressive.
The number of lights you hit, right? And then in the reading and the reactive side, it's the number of you saw versus hit. And so you want you want that number to be as close as possible, as well as high as possible. And the reading part of it is simply just engaging in the executive functioning task. Now, they could make it more complicated, right? They could add on more variables and say like, okay, we're going to read faster while we're doing this. But for the sake of science, right, it's progressive in that we can't just do the hardest and the most amount of variables at once. Otherwise, you're not going to get good data, or it's going to be very hard to find what is um, the independent variable in that situation.
Now, a light board strikes me as being quite a fancy bit of kit. I wonder if there's less jazzy items that people would have access to all over the world and wouldn't necessarily need a performance institute to get
Running to
hold
an
of it.
audiobook
Right, I
is
was
the
thinking
cheapest.
walking and having a conversation with a friend. Like
That
it's
is
like
that is a dual task processing thing
right, not
that we do all
tripping
the time.
over the curbs and
Mhm.
not getting hit by traffic, but also paying
Absolutely.
attention to the conversation and trying to somewhat be coherent. Yeah, that came to my mind when you were
That's
talking
the
about them tools.
cheapest, I would say the easiest and cheapest way for someone to engage is exercising with an audiobook, not music, right? Because music is rhythmic and you memorize it, right? Listening to an audiobook, podcast, stuff like that, to listen to it, to actually remember it, that is very stronger executive functioning while you're doing a motor function, right? So that is one of the, I would say, more accessible ways. Those light boards, to answer your question, can be thousands of dollars, tens of like 12. I think the one that we had was like 15 grand. And then there were people, the newer technology though, that are touch boards um, are in the lesser range, right? And then the newer stuff that's still, I believe, is still very experimental is using VR to do that, right? Because now the environment is very controllable and you can have people do a lot more stuff when engaging their feet more, their whole body, and then using VR for recovery as well, right? Because the idea of, I don't know if we've ever talked about overmapping when it comes to recovery and injury recovery and things like that.
No, but let's
No.
hold on to that because
Yeah.
we can go into it. But
Yeah,
I
of
was just
course.
thinking, yeah, VR sounds fascinating in terms of controlling variables. And I mean, for the analog, low budget folk out there, get back squatting and get this podcast in your ears, and
Yeah.
you'll be preventing more than you realise. Yeah,
Agility
overmapping.
drills while listening to a podcast
Yeah, there you go. Yeah,
about
yeah,
agility, about doing dual task processing.
yeah. There you go. Just really screw up the macro processor.
Uh-huh.
Overmapping. Talk to me.
Overmapping, yeah. So this is not a field. I'll just put a disclaimer. I'm not an expert in this. It's something I learned about working in the recovery side of concussion, and the idea of overmapping simply being that a lot of our when we go back to the idea of learning, explicit versus implicit learning, simply meaning that when we learn to walk, when we learn to run, when we typically learn an athletic skill, there's a lot of it does come. There's a little lot of intuition and especially when we talk about walking or running, right? I'm not talking about refining it yet, but just simply walking and running. Um, it becomes very implicit, right? So there's a certain amount of space to be plain in your brain that those movements take up that are mapped, right? Those movements are mapped. I know how to um, throw a ball and move my shoulder and my arm in a certain way to do that. Um, in jujitsu, I understand and have it completely. It's natural to grab an arm in a certain way, to move in a certain way, to move my body because I've built that proprioception. I've mapped those movements, right? Those macro and those micro movements. In the instance of an injury, we go through rehab, right? A lot of times you see a physical therapist, they tell you, let's use the knee as an example. You're staring at your knee, you lift it and extend it and do extension, lifting a weight or doing something other type of exercise. You're looking in a mirror, you're watching your knee to move left and right as you squat down in, like, say, a controlled pistol squat or something like that. And you are very observant of that movement, right? It's extremely explicit, it's extremely conscious, and there's almost like a narrative that you have built. And what happens, and they see this in fMRI, is that you have there that when you think about moving that limb post recovery, way more lights up in your brain than when you think about moving the other side that has never been injured. So what you've done now is created this kind of explicit rather than an implicit or a relationship where you are overly conscious of that movement in the sense that a lot more of your ability or your brain power is going towards that maneuver or use of that limb or joint or what have you. So what happens is I think there is a 60% chance that you will tear your other ACL once you've teared one, right? Especially if someone who continues to engage in the same sport or similar sport. A lot of the reasons the supposition here is it's the overcompensation, right? Why does overcompensation happen? Because when we went through rehab, we were so conscious of rehabilitating that single joint that we actually end up putting it in a space of we overmap it. We're so conscious. So every time we go to use it, we don't necessarily plant the same way. We don't necessarily stride the same way or put the same weight. We lift weights and we might lean a little bit on the other side, which overstresses that other knee that wasn't injured. And that's the theory of why that happens. So, kind of in the same vein of dual processing, right? You have different types of things you can do to help recovery. And the VR, I mentioned VR, but a simple one, and I mentioned this in dual processing, is if I'm trying to strengthen the balance of that knee through just if I have to stand on one leg, that's throwing the ball against the wall. Because what it does is I'm building that strength in an implicit way because I'm not focusing on balance as much as I'm trying to catch that ball. And now I've been distracted. And one of the things I did with concussion rehab, right, is one of the exercises, I would walk around somebody and toss them a ball and they'd have to toss it back to me. And I would change the height I threw it. I'd bounce it at times and I would toss it up. So they're standing on one leg and they're remapping and they're starting to rebuild that neuromechanical coupling. But you can do the same thing with knee injury, right? So they're trying to track and follow and they're twisting and turning and I'm trying to catch that ball and I'm looking for it and I have to now throw it back and now I'm tracking, right? I'm tracking you, I'm moving, I'm engaging more than just standing here and looking at my knee to make sure it doesn't do this or that or what have you. So what that has done is created a lot of very positive outcomes. The person, his name just came to me, who has wrote a lot about this. His name is Dr. Dustin Grooms. So Dustin, Groms, and he has written a lot about this overmapping and how it leads to re-injury, and how these types of interventions have helped with preventative or with actual true recovery, right, where we're not overly mapped.
I see it a lot in the S&C world, overcompensation for sure,
Yeah,
especially post injury. I felt it myself as well, getting too hyper obsessed about, not doing something a certain way, and then my movement patterns changing for the worse, and then causing more problems. So yeah, it definitely makes sense. I've got experience with that. Um, Joey, this has been a fantastic deep dive,
yeah,
mate.
yeah, for
We've
sure.
unpacked some really cool stuff there, and I'd probably get you back on again, and we could go even further.
Yeah.
What's on the menu regarding sort of performance consultancy coming up for you? Anything exciting in the works these next few months? There's loads of fights going on. I know
Yeah.
that much.
As typical, and he's spoken about it, so I can speak to it without feeling I'm betraying anyone's confidence. But Corey has a fight coming up with TJ, right? Soon. We'll be working together through this camp, like we have worked together with a lot of camps. Um, As it comes for everybody else, though, I have a lot of the other ones. They're just, unfortunately, they are private clients, and so, but there are a lot of people I am starting to work with more. Um, which is awesome because it means that there's this exposure to sport and performance psychology, and I'm hearing more about colleagues of mine getting into this field as well. I had student, which fortunate and I'm very humbled by this. Like Cory had the grace to mention that our work together when he went interviewed on Rogan. So like a lot of people actually, I think, have been exposed to the idea of like, hey, a mental coach is as much a part of your team. And so I've had colleagues and students in the world of sport and performance psychology reach out about that work, which means that more people are getting involved and more people are getting interested. So to me, not so much who I'm working with matters, but the fact that people are doing the work. Right. So, and that's awesome. And that's a great exposure for this world, and that bringing the mental coach into it. So I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm excited for that fight, and I think you're right. It's coming into the limelight more and more,
Yeah.
especially in combat sports. Like, I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you're a fighter and you're not employing
Uh-huh.
someone who understands the performance, mental psychology sort of component. I think it's super useful.
Absolutely.
Whether you're more brawn than brains or more brains than brawn, I don't think it
Right.
matters.
Hmm.
If people want to work with you, Joey, how can they get a hold of you? What's the best kind of method to get in touch and maybe start that
Yeah.
process?
I mean, I don't, as I think people have started to follow me on Instagram and realize that I'm not super active on social media. However, I mean, I have a LinkedIn. You can just look me up by Joseph Fritz, or you can reach out to me on Instagram, um, and on the Fritzer, Fritzer 523, and or just look me up by name. I think you can find me that way, and just shoot me a message, and I will be more than happy to reach out and to chat about what that looks like, or even talk to people about this world and working in it and what that's like.
Fantastic. Okay, we'll make sure then I include all that stuff in the show notes so people can get a hold of you.
Yeah,
Joey, it's been a pleasure once again, mate. My
yeah. Thanks, Eric.
brain has been blown in the best way possible.
Good. I'm glad.
Yeah, stoked. And yeah, let's get you back soon.
Awesome. Yep. Sounds great.
This episode of the Move Mind podcast was brought to you by CBD Mountain, for sport and fitness CBD. Head over to cbdmountain.com for a range of soft gels, skin balms, oils, and vapes, and purchase online and have the premium quality CBD delivered directly to your door. cbdmountain.com.